Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking way up, about 240,000 miles away actually. There's this new rush back to the moon. Global players, private companies. Everyone's gearing up.
It's definitely heating up.
But it raises this huge question. Who actually owns the moon? I
Right.
mean, the dust, the rocks, potential water ice, that helium-3 everyone talks about.
Right. Who owns the resources? It's fundamentally a question of property rights in a place with no precedent.
Exactly. It feels like a new gold rush. And the irony is pretty thick here because the world actually tried decades ago to write the rule book for this exact moment,
They did, and that effort largely failed to get traction where it mattered most.
which is fascinating. So our mission today is a deep dive into that specific attempt, the 1979 agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies.
Yeah.
Most people just call it the Moon Treaty.
Tinsler, yeah.
We want to unpack its, really idealistic goals, but also understand why it's now pretty much disregarded, often just called, quote, a failed attempt at constraining free enterprise.
That summary captures the prevailing view, certainly among the major spacefaring nations today.
Okay, so let's get the basics down first, just the facts.
Sure. So the treaty text was finalized and opened for signature in late 1979, December 18th, to be precise.
But it didn't just switch on then, right?
No, it had a clause. It needed 5 countries to formally ratify it before it actually entered into force. That took a while,
How long?
until July 11th, 1984, so almost 5 years later.
Okay, and how many countries are actually party to it now, like as of 2024?
Still very few. As of May this year, only 17 states are parties.
17.
17, that sounds low, especially for a UN treaty about the moon.
It is extremely low, especially when you consider who isn't on that list.
Ah, okay, here's the kicker, I bet. The fact that tells the whole story.
Pretty much. Here it is. 0 states that currently have the capability to launch their own human spaceflight missions have ratified the treaty.
0. So that means the US,
Look,
Russia,
yeah.
China.
Not ratified. Wow. Okay. So the countries actually going to the moon or planning to send people soon, they're not bound by this treaty at all.
Correct. Which, immediately raises the question of its relevance in practical terms today. If the main actors aren't playing by those rules, what force do the rules really have?
It makes it seem almost like a historical document rather than active international law for the key players.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into why. Why this huge disconnect? Where did it start?
You've got to go back to the context. Before the Moon Treaty, the main space law was the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, a landmark agreement.
Right, the one that says no nukes in orbit, no planting flags and claiming sovereignty. The basics.
Exactly. It laid the foundation. But by the late 1970s, technology was advancing. People could see a future where space wasn't just about exploration, flags, and footprints, but about exploitation, using resources.
Mining, manufacturing, settlements.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Potentially, yes. And there was a feeling, particularly among developing nations at the UN, that the 1967 treaty was maybe a bit too vague on resource rights. They needed something more specific.
So the Moon Treaty was supposed to be Outer Space Treaty 2.0, focused on resources.
In a way, yeah. It aimed to provide more detailed legal principles. Its core objective was really ambitious, to set up an international regime to manage lunar exploration and, crucially, the administration of its resources.
An international regime, that sounds bureaucratic, but also potentially very powerful.
It was meant to ensure the moon was used, and this is key, for the benefit of all states and all peoples, not just the ones who could afford the rockets.
Okay, that's the core philosophy then. Space is a global commons, a shared inheritance.
Precisely. The common heritage of mankind concept. The idea was that any wealth generated, say, from mining helium-3 wouldn't just belong to the miner, it should somehow benefit everyone, even nations with no space program.
That is radically different from how things work on Earth with resources.
Radically different, and very idealistic.
And when you look at the specific articles in the treaty, you see that idealism woven throughout, right?
Absolutely. It covers a lot of ground.
Like the military stuff. It flat out bans any military use. No weapons testing, no military bases, full stop.
Well, almost full stop. It does have a small carve-out allowing military personnel to be used, but only for peaceful scientific purposes.
Okay, fair enough. Astronauts often have military backgrounds. What else?
Environmental protection was big, too. It requires states to prevent contamination of the moon and other bodies.
So don't bring Earth germs up there.
Right. And just as importantly, prevent contamination of Earth from anything brought back. Think Andromeda strain, maybe.
Okay, good call. We don't want moon plagues. What about science?
Freedom of scientific research is guaranteed for everyone, no discrimination. But there's a telling phrase. It says, samples collected during research are hoped to be shared.
Hoped, not required.
Hoped. The softer touch there.
Yeah.
And it's very clear. Putting your lander or your rover down somewhere doesn't create any ownership rights over that territory. Use doesn't equal ownership.
That reinforces the 1967 treaty. No land grabs.
Definitely. They were trying to nail that down.
You know, reading through the source material, the thing that really jumped out at me, showing the sheer, maybe even naive, scope of their ambition, Article 5.3.
Ah, yes. The extraterrestrial life clause.
Right. It says state parties have to promptly inform the UN Secretary General, the public, and the international scientific community of any signs of alien life they discover,
It's quite something, isn't it? They're drafting procedures for first contact.
while simultaneously failing to agree on rules for, digging up rocks for profit. It just shows how theoretical the resource issue must have felt compared to, well, finding ET.
I think that's a fair assessment of the mindset, perhaps. But legally, the real core of the treaty, and honestly the source of its eventual failure to launch, politically speaking, is Article 11.
Article 11. Okay, what's in there?
This is where they drop the two concepts that became political poison for the major space powers. First, it explicitly applies the phrase, common heritage of mankind, to the moon and its resources.
Okay, that phrase again. We know where that leads.
And second, building on that, it bans national appropriation of lunar resources, not just the land, but the resources themselves. It says appropriation is forbidden, quote, by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means.
Whoa, okay, wait, let's pause on that. By any other means. That sounds incredibly broad.
It is.
So if you can't appropriate resources by means of use, how can a company possibly justify spending billions to go mine ice, process it, and sell it as rocket fuel if they don't own the ice they just dug up?
And that right there is the fundamental conflict, the absolute sticking point that has plagued this treaty from day one.
The common heritage language implies, some kind of mandatory sharing of profits, centralized UN control over mining licenses.
That's how opponents interpreted it, yes. And the ban on appropriation just seemed completely incompatible with any kind of commercial venture. It's why the treaty is often called unfinished or imprecise.
Because it sets up this ideal, but doesn't explain how it works in practice.
Precisely. It actually doesn't ban commercial mining outright. It allows for resource exploitation. But there's a huge but.
Always a but.
But only after this international regime, this set of rules and procedures for managing it has been established by the state parties.
Okay, so it's like saying you can drive this car, but first we all have to agree on the exact traffic laws, the licensing system, the insurance requirements, and how we'll share the gas money.
That's a pretty good analogy. Article 11, paragraph 5 specifically says the parties undertake to establish this regime as such exploitation is about to become feasible.
About to become feasible. So they knew it was coming, but they deferred figuring out the rules.
They did. They set up a condition precedent.
Yeah.
You can't start digging until we agree on how to share the spoils, essentially.
And let me guess. They never agreed.
Bingo. Multiple UN conferences tried. They held meetings, debates, but could never reach a consensus on what this international regime should actually look like. How would licensing work? How would benefits be shared? Total gridlock.
So the crucial mechanism was just missing, left completely undefined.
Which led to this bizarre situation. Even S. Neil Hosenball, who was NASA's general counsel and the chief U.S. negotiator for the Moon Treaty.
The guy who helped write it.
That guy. Years later, in 2018, he essentially said, look, maybe we should just wait to define the rules until resource exploitation is actually feasible. Let's kick the can down the road.
Wait a minute. That seems backward. If you wait until it's already feasible, doesn't that mean the countries or companies who can do it will just start doing it under their own rules?
Many legal scholars would say yes, absolutely.
Doesn't that completely undermine the whole common heritage principle? You're basically letting the pioneers set the terms.
It arguably does. That delay, that failure to define the regime, created a vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped private companies and national interests demanding regulatory clarity, but on their terms.
Not based on global sharing, but on enabling investment.
Right. There was this quote from a lawyer summarizing the challenge. The regime needed to somehow prevent a single company from getting a monopoly, while also avoiding the socialization of the moon.
A tricky balancing act. Maybe impossible in the political climate?
It certainly proved impossible to agree upon at the international level back then.
Which leads us right into the opposition, especially in the U.S., that basically stopped the treaty in its tracks from the start.
Yeah, there was significant and ultimately successful lobbying against U.S. ratification. Groups like the L5 Society were very active.
And their main argument was,
Fundamentally, that the Moon Treaty was anti-free enterprise, anti-private property rights, that the common heritage language and the undefined international regime would stifle innovation, kill any incentive for private investment, and basically hand control over to some inefficient UN bureaucracy.
the socialization of the moon fear.
Exactly. The core economic argument was, why would any company spend billions on a lunar mining operation if they didn't have clear rights to own and sell what they extracted? The uncertainty was a deal breaker.
So this sentiment, this pushback, led to some alternative ideas, right? Like,
Yeah.
maybe we don't need to claim the land itself.
Right. People like Lee Ratner proposed a different approach. Forget claiming sovereignty over the territory. The 1967 treaty already bans that anyway. Focus instead on securing the exclusive right to use or exploit the resources you extract.
Ah, so it's like fishing rights in international waters.
That's the common analogy, yeah. You don't own the patch of ocean where you catch the fish, but once the fish are in your boat, they're yours. Legally yours to sell.
So apply that to the moon. You don't own the crater you're mining in, but the water ice you dig up and put in your tanker truck, that's your property.
That was the alternative legal theory being floated. Treat the extracted resource as property, thereby sidestepping the treaty's ban on appropriating the resources in place.
Clever, but still fundamentally different from the Moon Treaty's vision.
Completely different. And because the international community couldn't agree on the Moon Treaty's regime, and because private companies were starting to seriously plan lunar missions and demanding legal certainty,
The nations started taking matters into their own hands.
precisely, we saw a major shift towards national legislation. The first big move, the one that really signaled the changing winds, was the U.S. in 2015.
What happened then?
Congress passed the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. Title IV of that act specifically grants U.S. citizens rights to possess, own, transport, use, and sell space resources they obtain.
Wow. So the U.S. just unilaterally declared that its companies can own resources mined in space.
Yes. It was a huge step, essentially creating a national framework because the international one envisioned by the Moon Treaty never materialized. It provided the regulatory clarity investors were seeking, at least under U.S. law.
That must have been like a starting gun for other countries.
It absolutely was. After the U.S. acted, you saw similar national laws pop up relatively quickly.
Mhm.
Luxembourg made a big push to become a hub for space mining companies and passed its own law.
Luxembourg. Interesting. Who else?
Japan followed suit. The UAE, China, India, Russia have also made statements or enacted policies supporting resource exploitation, though their specific legal frameworks might differ. The trend was clear. Major players were creating their own rules.
So everyone just decided to go their own way rather than wait for the UN.
It appears so. Now, it's really important to add here, many international law experts argue vigorously that these national laws are not consistent with the Moon Treaty.
Because the treaty bans appropriation, and these laws seem to allow it.
Exactly. They also argue it might conflict with customary international law that evolved from the Outer Space Treaty. So you have this growing legal conflict. National laws providing commercial certainty versus potentially conflicting international principles.
A real mess, a patchwork of competing regulations.
That's a good way to put it. And this conflict reached a kind of philosophical peak in 2020.
What happened in 2020?
Two things, really, driven by the U.S. First, the launch of the Artemis Accords.
Ah, the Accords. We hear a lot about them. They're not a treaty, right?
Yeah.
More like guidelines.
There are a series of bilateral agreements between the U.S. and other signatory nations, setting out principles for cooperation in lunar exploration, mostly based on the Outer Space Treaty. But they specifically include a section affirming that space resource extraction and utilization should be conducted under the Outer Space Treaty, implicitly endorsing the view that it's permissible.
So they're building a coalition around a framework that allows resource use, directly challenging the Moon Treaty's approach.
That seems to be the intent. And to make the point even clearer, around the same time the Accords were rolled out, the U.S. president issued an executive order.
What did it say?
It stated very explicitly that the United States does not view outer space as a global commons.
Wow, directly rejecting that core concept.
Directly. And it went on to call the Moon Agreement a failed attempt at constraining free enterprise.
Okay, so that's pretty unambiguous. The U.S. position is, Moon Treaty failed, space isn't a commons, Let's move on with a system that supports commercial activity via the Artemis Accords.
That's the clear message. It frames the current reality. A push towards a non-universal, commercially oriented system, prioritizing investment and national interests over the Moon Treaty's ideal of global equitable sharing.
So if we step back now,
Hmm.
what does this all mean for the legal landscape you need to navigate today? It sounds incredibly fragmented.
It is. You have this idealistic Moon Treaty, still technically law, but ratified by very few, and none of the major human spaceflight powers. You have a growing number of national laws authorizing mining, which might conflict with that treaty, and you have the Artemis Accords creating a separate competing framework based on bilateral
It's
agreements.
confusing. Can these different systems even coexist? Which brings up that really interesting case, Australia.
Yes, Australia is unique. They're one of the few countries that has signed and ratified both the Moon Treaty and the Artemis Accords.
How is that even possible? They seem philosophically opposed.
That's the million-dollar question everyone's asking. It forces a discussion. Is harmonization actually possible? Can you somehow reconcile the common heritage principle with the Accords' focus on commercial utilization under national supervision? Australia seems to think you can, or at least that they don't directly conflict yet.
Is there any proposed way to bridge this gap? To maybe revive the Moon Treaty spirit?
Well, the main idea that keeps coming up, the theoretical fix that proponents advocate for, is to finally create that missing piece, a definitive implementation agreement for the Moon Treaty.
The how-to guide they never wrote back in the 70s and 80s.
Exactly. Remember, the treaty itself allows exploitation once the regime is in place. An implementation agreement would be that regime. It would provide the detailed rules, how licenses are granted, environmental standards, safety zones, maybe even those benefit sharing mechanisms.
So in theory, it could provide the regulatory clarity that companies want,
Yeah.
but within the original common heritage framework.
That's the hope of its supporters. They believe it could address the treaty's shortcomings, make it more acceptable to major powers, and provide a truly international framework rather than the patchwork we have now. It would turn the aspirational principles into something concrete and operational.
But we come back to the same practical problem, don't we?
Yeah.
Getting international agreement on those details, especially the money part.
That's always been the hurdle. The belief, particularly strong in the U.S. and among commercial players, is that guaranteed rights to the economic benefits, the profits, are absolutely essential to justify the huge private investment needed for lunar missions.
And without clear rules guaranteeing that return on investment, whether from the Moon Treaty, IA, or the Artemis Accords companies, are hesitant.
They fear regulatory uncertainty. What if you spend billions setting up a mine and then the rules change? Or a competing claim arises under a different legal system? That lack of clarity is seen as the biggest blocker to large-scale private activity right now.
So it really boils down to a fight over profit and who gets to set the rules for making it.
Sadly, yes. The controversy over claims and mining rights for profit has largely dominated the discussion for decades now. It's sidelined many of the Moon Treaty's other important goals, like preventing conflict, ensuring scientific cooperation for all, protecting the environment.
The focus today isn't idealism. It's about regulatory certainty for wealth extraction.
That seems to be the dominant driver, yes.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The core tension is crystal clear. We have the 1979 dream of the moon as the common heritage of all mankind, managed internationally for everyone's benefit,
A beautiful, idealistic vision.
versus the current reality. National laws being passed, driven by commercial interests needing regulatory clarity, primarily focused on enabling private profit and coalescing around the U.S.-led Artemis Accords framework.
And the Moon Treaty itself, still on the books, but ratified mostly by nations without independent launch capabilities. It stands as this powerful, almost poignant reminder of how incredibly difficult it is to get global consensus when potentially vast resources and profits are at stake.
Which leaves us with a really important question for the future, doesn't it?
I think it does. Here's something for you to mull over. If the real key to unlocking space development isn't necessarily ideological agreement on common heritage, but simply achieving regulatory clarity, clear rules of the road, does pursuing that elusive implementation agreement for the Moon Treaty still offer the best path forward? Could it balance commercial development with benefits for all humanity?
Or has that ship sailed? Are the Artemis Accords, with their focus on national frameworks and bilateral deals, already too far ahead? Is that profit-driven, nationally focused model simply the inevitable future for how we manage resources off Earth? Which path ultimately leads to orderly, safe, and maybe even sustainable use of space in the long run?
That's the multi-billion, maybe trillion-dollar question. Which framework will define the next 100 years in space?
Something to think about. Thank you for sharing your sources for this deep dive. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.